Deep beneath the surface, away from the warmth of the sun, civilizations grow in the shadows, sculpted by the constraints and mysteries of the underground. These subterranean societies bring forth tales and legends that resonate in echoing chambers, whispering stories of bravery and sacrifice, and the unique challenges of life below. But how would such a civilization live? What would they wear? How would their magic work? Today, we will journey into the heart of the caverns and discover how a fantasy world builder can birth legends that are carved from the rock and resonate with the deep drumbeats of an underground world. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. I was going to do the whole underground civilization in one video, but I fell down too many research holes, so this will be at least a two-parter. In this video, we will cover the basics of life like sight, light, food, and shelter. Next time, we'll get into cultural changes that I envisage for an underground civilization. If you're excited for that, hit the subscribe button and leave a comment down below letting me know what you hope to see. Just before we do get into today's video, if you want to help me make more videos and read some pretty cool fantasy books, check out my books. There is my epic fantasy series, Sangwil Chronicles, where I explore how the past shapes the future. It's received some pretty good reviews, so check it out on Amazon or any other book retailer. There are also some signed copies available on starvingwriterstudio.com. And on that same site, you can pick up a copy of the science fantasy novel, Magic Fall, that I co-wrote with my podcast partner, Drake. Or, if you like erotic fantasy that isn't just elven prawn, check out my work under the pen name Talia Tethers. So those are all my books that you can pick up in support of this channel, and please know that I appreciate every purchase and especially everyone who's given me a review. Okay, enough of that. Let's get cracking with underground civilizations. In my opinion, before you do anything else, you should ask if your people can see or not. Do they use sight at all? Before we talk about the options for light underground, let's talk about the potential for a blind adapted species and how that could work in a fantasy world. Numerous creatures on Earth have adapted to environments where sight is either less useful or entirely unnecessary. This is often seen in animals that live in complete darkness, such as in deep sea environments, or in underground caves, such as we'll be discussing. The ways in which those species have adapted can give us some guidance for how an underground sentient race might evolve. So let's explore those options. The first way a species might adapt is through enhancement of other senses, such as hearing or touch sensitivity. I'm actually going to start with touch sensitivity because I want to talk about a physical adaptation that humans don't have, but which is amazing for animals that can't see, and that adaptation is whiskers. Whiskers, also known as vibrissae, are incredibly sensitive tactile organs found in many mammals, including cats, and sadly excluding the great apes, which is us, and the other great apes. So we don't have whiskers, no matter how much we might want them. Now, these specialized hairs provide a wealth of information about the environment to the animal. What kind of information? Let me tell you. Whiskers can help animals judge the size of openings. It is a bit of an old wives' tale that a cat's whiskers are as long as the body is broad, but whiskers can still help a cat judge how far it is from a wall or how near it is to hitting a barrier. The sensitivity of whiskers allows cats to detect even changes in the air currents. Not joking, their whiskers are so sensitive they can detect movement through the motion of the air. This capability is very beneficial in the dark, as it can alert the cat to the presence of nearby objects or movement, potentially revealing the location of prey or even a threat. And speaking of prey, when a cat catches prey with its mouth, the whiskers move forward, encircling the prey. This helps the cat position its bite accurately, especially in the dark. Whiskers can detect tiny vibrations that might indicate the movement of prey. So if you're creating an underground race, I definitely consider giving them whiskers. And remember, you don't have to stick to whiskers on the nose or whatever. Vibraceae typically grow in clusters. Many land animals have 4 typical whisker groups on their heads called cranial vibraceae, which include above the eyes, on the cheeks, where a moustache would be, and under the snout. But they also have whiskers on their bodies. Many mammals, including the cat, have vibraceae on the underside of the leg above the paws, called carpal vibraceae. There are also other groups that have been reported more occasionally. For example, there has been reported nasal, angular, and submental whiskers. In fact, it is speculated that all the hairs on the manatee might be vibraceae, though that is, of course, a sea mammal. But imagine how touch-sensitive it must be if that's true. And speaking of sea mammals, marine mammals can have substantially different arrangements of their vibraceae. For instance, whales and dolphins have lost their snout whiskers and gained vibraceae around their blowholes to detect obstructions. The long and the short of it is that you can go wild with the location of whiskers, and they can be an amazing addition to giving a blind race a serious leg up in terms of getting around. But touch is not the only sense. You could, of course, also increase your people's scent, and this could be how they identify people. Instead of describing how a thing looks, they could describe how a thing smells, and their language could center around scent, and it could be as rich as our language around sight. Scents could have colors and shapes and all kinds of attributes associated with them. Even for us humans, each person has a unique scent by which they can be identified, and dogs, for example, can follow that scent even if you're actively trying to shake them. Mark Rober did a great video on that topic, which I highly recommend to anyone delving into scents. I would also say here that I use scents for my blind character, which I introduced in the Ducal Heir and who will have a larger role in the upcoming 3rd book. And my blind character uses scents to describe who characters are to her. So every character in my story that now interacts with that blind character also has a note for what that character smells like. I just thought that was an interesting aside. And now back to the video and senses, and let's talk about hearing. Of course, you can also vastly increase the hearing of your blind people, and that can also become advanced echolocation hearing. Echolocation is most famously used by animals like bats and dolphins, and it is the ability to determine the location of objects by emitting sounds and listening for the echoes those sounds would produce. Even in our world, some blind individuals have developed a form of echolocation to help them navigate their environments, something that I used in my books when I introduced that self-same blind character in the Ducal Heir. So how does echolocation work for people? Well, the person produces a clicking sound with their mouth. These clicks bounce off objects in the environment and return as echoes. By listening closely to the returning echo, specifically the time it takes for the echo to return, and any variations in the sound, the individual can determine where objects are located, their size, and sometimes their shape and texture. Research suggests that individuals who are blind and use echolocation show a heightened activity in the visual cortex when processing echo sounds. This suggests that the brain can repurpose the visual cortex for processing auditory information in the absence of visual input, essentially seeing with your ears, which is honestly just awesome. One of the most famous proponents of human echolocation is Daniel Kish, who has been blind since childhood. Kish taught himself to navigate using echolocation, and he has since founded an organization called World Access for the Blind to teach these skills to others. He can actually ride a bike using echolocation, which is absolutely incredible. Link to a video of that down below if you find that interesting. Now, of course, human echolocation does have its limitations. The range and resolution of human echolocation isn't as precise as those found in animals like bats. But you can easily adapt a race living underground to be capable of emitting sounds outside the range of normal human hearing that can paint a very effective, if somewhat staccato, picture of the world around them. So that's all the things you can do to a blind race in terms of enhancing the senses. And those are the senses that we know and understand. But is there something more exotic you can introduce to a blind species without resorting to straight-up magic? I'm so glad you asked. Let's talk about electroreception. Electroreception and electrogenesis are biological abilities to perceive electrical stimuli and to generate electric fields. Both are used to locate prey, and stronger electric discharges can be used to stun the prey. So these things are used predominantly by fish, but don't let that stop you adapting it to your world and to your underground people. So let's go into the details of what this electrolocation is and how the passive differs from the active. In passive electrolocation, the animal senses weak bioelectric fields generated by other animals and uses it to locate those animals. These electric fields are generated by all animals due to the activity in their nerves and muscles. Passive electroreception usually relies upon ampullary receptors, such as the ampulla of the Lorenzini, which are sensitive to low-frequency stimuli below 50 Hz. These receptors have a jelly-filled canal leading from the sensory receptor to the skin surface. In active electrolocation, fish actually generate a weak electric field and sense the different distortions of that field created by objects that conduct or resist electricity. Let that sink in for a moment. You could create a species that literally creates their own electric field and uses it to see with, and you don't need magic for it. Anyway, back to these fish. This electric field is generated by means of a specialized electric organ consisting of modified muscles or nerves. This field is either generated in small electric pulses, termed pulse type, like the elephant fishes, or produced as a quasi-sinusoidal discharge from the electric organ, termed a wave type, like the knife fishes. The field is called weak if it is only enough to detect prey, and strong if it is powerful enough to stun or kill, like the electric eel, which of course is not an eel, but is actually a knife fish. Speaking of the electric eel, it locates prey by generating a weak electric field, and then discharges the electric organ to stun the prey with a strong field. Yep, it detects its prey with electricity and then stuns it with more of the same. How cool is that? And of course, such an ability to create electricity can be used for other things besides just seeing. You could use it for performative arts or for communication. Indeed, in some species of fish, the generation and perception of electric fields can serve as a means of communication, either to attract mates or to establish territories. Or so we think, anyway. So if you're looking to build a blind species, I definitely give electroreception a long, hard look as a potential adaptation for your fantasy race. And if you enjoyed that overview of creating a blind species adaptation, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about light underground. So maybe you do want your species to see normally. That being the case, you're going to need to import some light. Now, you could of course go with fire, but why go to all the effort of creating a specialized underground species and then just use fire as light? So let's talk about some way more fun options. As I see it, you have 3 options for light underground. The first is bioluminescence. Now, in our world, this is again mostly in the ocean, but don't let that stop you. You can make anything bioluminescent. You could have bioluminescent fungi, worms, insects, animals, even plants. Basically, bioluminescence is when living organisms produce light through a chemical reaction. What happens is this chemical luciferin reacts with a luciferase enzyme and produces an excited state molecule that emits light as it returns to its ground state. The exact color of the light depends on the specific type of luciferin. So luciferin is why fireflies have that yellow color in their light. Organisms can control where, when, and how they produce light. For instance, the lanternfish has light-producing organs, or photophores, scattered across its body, and it can control the intensity and frequency of the light produced. So bioluminescence is definitely an option, but maybe you don't want the light to be, based on a creature. Well, we already talked about the chemical reaction of bioluminescence. There are other chemical reactions that also create light. The most common example of chemiluminescence is glow sticks. A glow stick contains 2 separate compartments, one inside the other. The outer compartment contains a solution of hydrogen peroxide, while the inner compartment, typically a glass vial, contains phenyl oxalate ester and a fluorescent dye. When the glow stick is bent, the glass vial breaks, allowing the 2 solutions to mix. The chemical reaction between the hydrogen peroxide and the phenyl oxalate ester produces a chemical called 1,2-dioxytadione. You can tell chemistry is not my thing, right? Anyway, this chemical is highly energetic and can transfer its energy to the fluorescent dye. When the dye molecules receive this energy, they release it as visible light. Another example of chemoluminescence is the reaction of luminol in forensic science. When luminol is oxidized, it produces a blue glow. This is often used in crime scenes to detect the trace amounts of blood, as the iron in blood can catalyze the oxidation of luminol, leading to the emission of light. The reaction involves the oxidation of luminol by hydrogen peroxide in the presence of a suitable catalyst. So, if you want to use chemical reactions, you can have your characters carry 2 vials around with them, and when they need light, they can mix the chemicals and voila, light. You can even have their own blood be one of those chemicals in a pinch where people, they need that oxidization. And depending on the chemicals involved, the light that you create from this might last minutes or it might last hours. Moreover, by varying the dyes or reactants, the color of the emitted light could be changed, giving you scope for art, decorations, and even communications. But of course, this is a fantasy world, and if you really do need to, you can, of course, turn to magic for your light. Norse mythology speaks of the sparkling halls of the dwarves, created by gems embedded in the rock itself. You could have crystals that emit light, glowing naturally in caves, where they are harvested. You could have certain rocks that can be invoked to show light in some way, like firestones in our world, but longer lasting and more mystical. And of course, you could have actual magic light created by wizards. These lights could be something the wizard places, like on a pebble, for example, or it could be an item that is enchanted, like a magic torch that the characters carry around. So those are the three options that I see for creating light. You can go with bioluminescence, the light comes from a creature, chemiluminescence, the light comes from mixing chemical elements together, or you could go for straight up magical lights and a wizard creates it, or it is a fantastical material that is in and of itself inherently magical. If you found value in this video so far, consider giving it a super thanks, and let's talk about food underground. Underground sunlight is a luxury, and this means photosynthesis is not really an option. So what can you do for agriculture and food? Fungi would be a key player here. A while ago I made a full video on fungi because they are really awesome, and you can check that out in the information card. Suffice to say here that you could use edible fungi as a lot of food sources. You could even have farms and farms of mushrooms, which could grow in any season. Just add water. But fungi by itself isn't going to be great. You want some extra stuff. Animals that are adapted to live underground can be an important food source as well. Good sources would be insects like crickets, beetles, and worms, which are protein-rich and can be grown on fungi. You could also leverage fish like the blind cavefish. And of course, small mammals like rats or bats could also be a good source for protein. Fermentation should also be easier underground, so consider having fermented mushrooms or even fermented meats, both for preservation and as a process to produce certain probiotics and other nutrients. And all that makes sense and is what any other world builder would tell you about growing things underground. I, however, still want my plants. So if we don't have photosynthesis, what can we use for plant growth? Let's talk about chemosynthesis. Chemosynthesis is the process by which certain organisms, typically bacteria and archaea, produce organic molecules using energy derived from reactions involving inorganic chemicals rather than light, as in photosynthesis. The most famous real-world example of this is the deep-sea hydrothermal vent ecosystems, where no sunlight can penetrate. The base of the food chain in these ecosystems isn't photosynthesizing plants, but chemosynthesizing bacteria. We could adapt that to an underground world by creating fantastical plants specifically adapted to chemosynthesizing. So I came up with some examples because I really like this concept. You could have vent trees that in an underground ecosystem, especially one riddled with geothermal vents, you could have these tall tree-like organisms that anchor themselves around vents. These trees could have a root system that tap into mineral-rich waters, deriving energy from chemical reactions. Their leaves might be more like specialized structures or organs designed to maximize chemical uptakes. And these trees could be primary producers of the underground food web and could still provide oxygen as a byproduct, which would be very important. You could also have a type of grass, like a sulfur grass, which would draw inspiration from real-world hydrothermal vents that release sulfur compounds. So this grass would grow on that sulfur. They could have a yellow or a golden hue and could cover vast plains near underground sulfur springs. It would stink to high heaven, but it would be very, very pretty. And then if you really want to go out there, you could have metalloflora. These could be plants that derive energy from oxidizing metals. They might eat away at underground metal deposits, releasing energy in the process. Their appearance could be shiny or metallic, and they might even incorporate these metals into their structures, resulting in naturally armored plants. You could also leverage acid pools, where you could have floating plants in the acid, which is rich in certain chemicals. These plants could draw energy from that chemical in the water, and they might have long tentacle-like roots which is submerged in the liquid with their main body floating on the surface. Of course, harvesting these would be a problem because you would not want to be caught in that acid splash. Chemosynthetic plants provide a wealth of possibilities that allow you to create a vibrant, alien-feeling underground ecosystem. The key is to consider what chemicals are abundant in your environment and then to imagine how plants might have evolved to exploit those resources. Remember, the primary goal of these plants is the same as their photosynthesizing counterparts: convert environmental energy into organic molecules. So if you're making a whole underground world or civilization, consider chemosynthetic plants and how you could use them in your food chain. And if you enjoyed that conversation about food, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about shelter and clothing. Even if your people live underground, they'll still need some kind of shelter, not only for reasons of privacy, but also for heat and protection from rockfalls and even predators and the like. So let's take a look at how homes would work in an underground civilization. You need to think of a couple of things when constructing an underground home. The first and probably most important is air. If you have chemosynthesizing plants, they might produce oxygen, which would alleviate this problem. But if you don't, air needs to come down from somewhere on the surface. In underground mines, they pump air from the surface because the miners literally use the air up. So your cavern or carved out hall of the Mountain King or whatever it is will either need some kind of plant life to produce oxygen or some kind of shaft that runs up to the surface and allows them to bring air down into the underground world. Or I suppose your species could be breathing something other than oxygen, but I'd be careful with that one because your readers might go like, okay, but what are they breathing? And then you have to find out some way to show it. Either way, you need to think about air and how it's handled by your species. Your second concern with underground homes is earthquakes or cave-ins. You'll want well-reinforced buildings that can take a few rocks falling on top of them. Beyond just reinforcement, there might also be systems in place that detect the slightest shifts or vibrations in the rock, acting as early warning systems for potential cave-ins. If an earthquake is coming, your people will definitely want to know about it. The third thing to think about in underground shelters is sound. Sound behaves very differently under the ground. In the next video, or maybe the one after that, depending on how the research rabbit holes go, I'll discuss sound underground in much more detail, especially with how it might affect communication and the arts. But in this video, suffice to say that chambers could be designed to amplify sounds for communal gatherings, or conversely, to dampen sounds for privacy in private homes. And your last consideration for shelter is temperature control. Deep underground, it can get pretty hot due to geothermal energy. But your people might be living closer to the surface, where they could use that geothermal energy to heat their houses. Channels or pipes could direct the warm air into their homes or into communal areas. You could use the Roman engineering like the hippocast to heat your homes. Your people could even have naturally heated pools or baths that can serve both functional and recreational purposes. Bathing was actually a super cultural thing in most of our cultures in the world, especially if you include things like sweat lodges and saunas. And if you'd like me to do a video on bathing and how to use it in a fantasy world, let me know in the comments. But just to finish up here with climate control, if your people live down in the earth, much closer to that geothermal heat, they'll need cooling. Probably this would take the shape of vents piping cool air or water down from the surface to lower the temperature, and then cycle the heated water back out, or something like that. So that covers houses. But what would these people wear? Clothing for an underground civilization would differ greatly from that of surface dwellers, primarily due to the environmental factors present beneath the surface. And again, you have some things that you need to think about when you're designing your clothing. Underground environments, especially deeper caverns, tend to maintain a constant, often cool temperature, especially when they're not close to that geothermal heat. Thus, in such a underground civilization, you would need insulating clothing. If the civilization domesticates any wool-producing animals adapted to the underground, like underground varieties of sheep or some kind of mole that maybe has wool or something like that, wool would be an ideal material. It insulates even when wet and can be spun into various thicknesses. Fur would also be a good option if you have creatures that produce it. Some kind of underground mink might be a useful fantasy animal to create for that purpose. Fur provides excellent insulation and can be used as linings or to make an entire garment. But caves don't just run cool, they're also pretty wet. Many caves have high humidity, and moisture-wicking properties would be vital to avoid fungal infections and other related health issues. You might want leather as an option, but maybe you don't have animals big enough to use for leather production. Fear not, fungi to the rescue. Some fungi can be processed into a leather-like material, which could be suitable for underground civilizations where fungi, of course, is very abundant. And speaking of leather, you also want to think about clothing durability. The abrasive environment with rough rocks and frequent crawling or climbing demands hard-wearing clothing. You might even do with your clothing what we do in Finland with winter layers, so your people could have an outside layer of tough, almost armored clothing, and inner, more comfortable clothing that you wear inside your house. I think helmets and boots would definitely be common. Helmets to protect you from the occasional pebble showers and larger rocks, and good boots to help navigate the underground terrain in dim or no light. I could see helmets especially becoming a high fashion accessory with all kinds of outlandish decorations. You could build a whole status culture out of helmets, including laws about who could wear what. And for my thoughts around those laws, check out my video on the topic of consumptory laws. And that covers the basics of underground civilizations in a fantasy world. If you want to say thanks for this video, super thanks is enabled, or you could become a channel member and get early access to my videos. If you enjoyed this video, check out my video on creating flying civilizations right over there. It really does help the algorithm if you click on those, after the video. So if you haven't seen it yet, check that out. And I will see you soon for another video. And don't forget to comment if you want more videos on underground civilization.